September 17th, 1631. A field outside Leipzig. Two armies face each other, and one of them is about to be annihilated. Just 1 year earlier, Gustavus Adolphus had stepped onto German soil with only 13,000 Swedes. The Catholic powers laughed. The Holy Roman Emperor barely noticed. What could a minor Nordic king possibly do against the war machine that had crushed Protestant armies for a decade? Today, they were about to find out. The morning sun rises over Breitenfeld, and the air itself feels heavy, pregnant with violence. 31,000 Imperial soldiers stand in formation, veterans, killers, men who have never known defeat. Across from them, the Swedish-Saxon alliance, roughly 40,000 men on paper. But paper doesn't win battles. Steel does. Discipline does. And the Imperials have both in terrifying abundance. This is the army that broke the Danes. The army that swept through Germany like a plague, leaving Protestant hopes burning in its wake. For 13 years, the 30 Years' War has ground on, and for 13 years, the Catholic League has seemed unstoppable. Their commander, the Count of Tilly, hasn't lost a major battle in his entire career. Let that sink in. Not one. And now, standing against this legendary force, is a 36-year-old king from a frozen northern kingdom that most Germans couldn't find on a map. So what was Gustavus thinking? Why would he gamble everything, his army, his reputation, his life, on this single September day? Because he had a secret. Actually, he had several. But we'll get to those. First, you need to understand what Gustavus was facing. The Imperial Army wasn't just big. It was a perfected killing system, refined over decades of brutal European warfare. At its core stood the tercio, massive blocks of infantry, sometimes 3,000 men deep, bristling with pikes and muskets. Imagine a human fortress, a moving wall of steel points and gunfire that simply rolled over anything in its path. The tercio had dominated European battlefields for over a century. Spanish tercios had crushed the French. Imperial tercios had shattered every Protestant army sent against them. The formation was slow, yes. Cumbersome, absolutely. But when it hit you, it hit like a sledgehammer wrapped in razor wire. And Tilly had 17,000 of these veteran infantry at Breitenfeld. Men who knew their business. Men who had watched enemy formations crumble before them so many times it had become routine. Then there was the cavalry. Gottfried Heinrich Graf zu Pappenheim commanded the Imperial horsemen, and he was everything you'd expect from a man with that name. Aristocratic, aggressive, and absolutely convinced of his own invincibility. His cavalry didn't just fight, they hunted. They had chased down broken Protestant armies across half of Germany, cutting down fleeing men like wheat before a scythe. Pappenheim was hungry for glory that morning, hungry and impatient. Remember that. It's going to matter. So there's your Imperial Army, undefeated infantry, savage cavalry, a commander who had never lost. 31,000 reasons why Gustavus Adolphus should have stayed in Sweden. Now let's look at what the Swedish king actually brought to this fight. His own Swedish troops numbered around 23,000. Well-trained, well-equipped, fanatically loyal to their king. But here's the problem. They'd never faced anything like the Imperial war machine. Sweden had fought Russians, Poles, Danes, regional conflicts in the Baltic, far from the apocalyptic meat grinder of Central Europe. This was different. This was the big leagues. And it gets worse. Because Gustavus wasn't fighting alone. His left flank, the entire left side of his battle line, was held by Saxons. 18,000 of them under the Elector John George. The Saxons looked impressive enough. Shiny armor, proud banners. But these weren't hardened veterans. Most had never seen a real battle. They were parade ground soldiers about to face the most terrifying army in Europe. Gustavus knew this. He knew he was anchoring half his line with troops who might shatter at the first serious pressure. But he had no choice. He needed the numbers. He needed the alliance. He needed something to fill that flank. So he put the Saxons on his left, positioned his own Swedes on the right and center, and prayed. Actually, that's not quite right. Gustavus Adolphus wasn't a man who relied on prayer alone. He had something else, something that would change warfare forever. He had a new way of killing. See, while the rest of Europe was still obsessed with the tercio, bigger blocks, deeper formations, more mass, Gustavus had been experimenting, thinking, reimagining how battles should be fought. What if, he wondered, you traded mass for speed, depth for flexibility? What if instead of one giant hammer, you had a dozen smaller ones that could strike anywhere, anytime? His infantry formations were revolutionary. Where a tercio might be 50 men deep, Swedish brigades were only 6 ranks deep. Thinner, lighter, but spread across a much wider front. They could wheel, pivot, respond to threats from multiple directions. They could do things that would take a tercio 20 minutes to accomplish in 20 seconds. And the firepower. Gustavus had figured out how to triple his infantry's rate of fire. Volley techniques, coordinated reloading. His musketeers could pour out a storm of lead that made Imperial veterans blink. But infantry was only part of it. His cavalry had been completely retrained. For decades, European cavalry had practiced something called the caracole, riding up to enemy lines, firing pistols, then wheeling away to reload. It looked pretty on parade grounds. In actual battle, it was almost useless. You'd fire a few inaccurate shots, then spend half the battle turning your horse around while the enemy infantry laughed at you. Gustavus threw the caracole in the eye. Trash where it belonged. His cavalry carried swords. They were trained to charge home, crash into the enemy, and kill at close quarters. No dancing around, no pistol games. Pure, savage, decisive shock. And then there was the artillery. This might have been his greatest innovation. Standard artillery of the era was heavy. Huge cannons that took teams of horses to move and forever to reload. You planted them before the battle and hoped you'd picked the right spot, because they weren't going anywhere. Gustavus had developed something different. Lighter guns, 3-pounders that a few men could actually move during a battle. Reposition. Bring to bear on new threats. Artillery that could keep pace with advancing infantry instead of sitting uselessly in the rear. He called them his leather guns because of their lightweight construction. His enemies would call them something else entirely. A nightmare. So here's the situation as the sun climbs higher over Breitenfeld. 2 armies facing each other across an open plain. The Imperials are confident, experienced, undefeated. They've seen Swedish-style armies before, smaller, weaker versions, and crushed them all. They look across at Gustavus and his odd formations, his thin lines, his strange deployment, and they see another Protestant army about to die. They have no idea what's coming. No idea at all. The morning starts with artillery. Both sides begin the deadly work of bombardment, iron balls screaming across the September sky, smashing into formations, turning men into red mist. It's almost ritualistic, a deadly overture before the real killing begins. The Imperial guns are heavier, more powerful, but Gustavus has more of them, and his crews work with a speed that seems almost unnatural to the watching enemy. Reload. Fire. Reload. Fire. The rhythm of death, played faster than anyone thought possible. For 2 hours, the guns speak. Men die in clusters, standing helpless in their formations, waiting for orders, watching friends torn apart by invisible violence. The smoke begins to build, a gray-white haze drifting across the field, turning distant formations into ghosts. And then Pappenheim can't wait anymore. Pappenheim. Remember that name. Remember that hungry, glory-starved Imperial cavalry commander who had spent the morning watching the artillery duel with growing frustration. He was supposed to wait. Tilly had a plan. The infantry would advance first, pin the enemy in place, and then, only then, the cavalry would sweep around and deliver the killing blow. It was textbook. It was proven. It had worked a dozen times before. But Pappenheim wasn't interested in textbooks. Maybe it was the smoke irritating his eyes. Maybe it was the distant sight of those thin Swedish lines, looking so fragile, so breakable. Maybe it was simply who he was, a man who had built his reputation on aggressive, decisive action. Whatever the reason, Pappenheim made a decision that would define the entire battle. He charged, without orders, without coordination, without any consideration for the overall plan. Pappenheim hurled his cavalry, thousands of elite Imperial horsemen, directly at the Swedish right flank. This is the moment where, in any normal battle, everything should have fallen apart for Gustavus. Cavalry charges were terrifying, thousands of pounds of horse and armored rider, moving at speed, hitting infantry lines with the force of an avalanche. Men broke, men ran. It was human nature. You saw that wall of death coming at you, heard the thunder of hooves shaking the earth beneath your feet, and something primal in your brain screamed one word: flee. The Swedish right flank saw Pappenheim coming. They saw 5,000 horsemen bearing down on them, sabers gleaming, the ground trembling with their approach. They didn't run. They didn't even flinch. The Swedish musketeers raised their weapons. Officers barked commands. And as Pappenheim's cavalry reached killing distance, the Swedes unleashed hell. Coordinated volley fire, hundreds of muskets discharging in unison, a wall of lead slamming into the charging horses. Animals screamed, men tumbled from saddles. The charge faltered, stumbled, broke apart against that impossible wall of disciplined firepower. Pappenheim pulled back, regrouped, stared at those thin Swedish lines that should have shattered and somehow hadn't. And then he charged again. Same result. The Swedes held their fire until the cavalry was close, agonizingly close, and then delivered another devastating volley. More horses down, more riders dead or dying in the September grass. Another charge broken. Pappenheim was furious now. This wasn't possible. These were Swedes, northern barbarians from some frozen wasteland. They weren't supposed to stand against Imperial cavalry. Nobody stood against Imperial cavalry. He charged a third time. The Swedes shot him apart again. A fourth time. Broken. A fifth. Slaughtered. A sixth. How were they still standing? How were these thin lines, these impossibly shallow formations, absorbing charge after charge from the finest cavalry in Europe? It defied everything Pappenheim knew about warfare. It defied logic itself. The seventh charge came. Pappenheim threw everything he had left, every remaining horseman, in one final desperate attempt to break those cursed Swedish lines. The volley that met him was just as murderous as the first, maybe more so. The Swedish musketeers had been doing this for 2 hours now. They had found their rhythm. Load, aim, wait, fire, reload. They were machines made of flesh and iron, and they simply would not break. 7 charges, 7 failures. Pappenheim's elite cavalry, the terror of Protestant Germany, had been fought to a standstill by infantry who weren't even supposed to be able to do this. But here's the thing about Pappenheim's fury, his obsessive need to break the Swedish right. While he was busy dying against Gustavus's disciplined musketeers, he wasn't paying attention to what was happening on the other side of the battlefield. And on the other side of the battlefield, everything was going catastrophically wrong. The Saxons. Remember them? 18,000 men holding the Allied left flank. Parade ground soldiers. Men who had never seen real combat. Tilly saw them. Tilly, unlike his cavalry commander, had been watching the whole battle unfold. He saw Pappenheim's reckless charges. He saw the Swedish right holding firm. And he saw something else. An opportunity. The Saxon flank looked weak. It looked exactly like what it was. Inexperienced troops trying very hard to pretend they weren't terrified. Tilly sent his infantry forward. Not against the Swedes. Against the Saxons. The Imperial tercios began their advance. Thousands of veterans, moving in those massive, unstoppable formations, heading directly for the Allied left flank. The ground shook with their footsteps. The air filled with the rattle of pike shafts, the clank of armor, the rhythmic thunder of professional soldiers doing what they did best. The Saxons watched them come, and the Saxons broke. It wasn't a fighting retreat. It wasn't a tactical withdrawal. It was a rout, a complete, instantaneous, catastrophic collapse. 18,000 men turned and ran as if the devil himself was chasing them. Some didn't even wait for the Imperial troops to reach them. They simply saw those tercios coming and decided that anywhere else was better than here. The Elector John George, the Saxon commander, was among the first to flee. He would later claim he was trying to rally his troops. Nobody believed him. He ran so fast and so far that he didn't stop until he reached Eilenburg, miles away, where he reportedly drank himself unconscious. In the span of maybe 30 minutes, Gustavus Adolphus lost half his army. Think about what this means. The entire left flank, gone. 18,000 men who were supposed to be protecting his side, vanished. The Imperial Army was now free to swing around and hit the Swedish force from the side, from behind, from any direction they chose. This is the moment when battles become massacres, when tactical defeats become total annihilation. History is filled with armies that collapsed when their flanks gave way. It's almost a law of warfare. Lose your flank, lose the battle, lose everything. The Imperial commanders saw it, too. They saw the Saxons streaming away, saw the gaping hole in the Allied line, and they absolutely knew, that victory was theirs. All they had to do was push through that gap, roll up the Swedish flank, and crush Gustavus between two fires. It was over. It had to be over. Tilly began repositioning his forces. His infantry started their ponderous wheel toward the exposed Swedish left. The tercio formations turned like massive ships changing course, slow but unstoppable, ready to deliver the killing blow. In the Imperial ranks, men were already celebrating. They had seen this before. The Protestant alliance was collapsing just like all the others. Another victory, another crushed enemy, another chapter in their unbroken legend. And then Gustavus Adolphus did something impossible. He refused to die. While lesser commanders would have panicked, while any sane general would have been screaming orders for retreat, trying to save whatever he could from the wreckage, Gustavus was already moving, already thinking, already 3 steps ahead of everyone else on that smoke-filled field. He had seen the Saxon collapse. He had seen his entire left flank evaporate. And in that moment of supreme crisis, something remarkable happened. He got calm. Not the calm of defeat, not the resignation of a man accepting his fate. The calm of a chess master who has just seen 20 moves into the future and knows exactly what he needs to do. The Swedish reserve began moving before the dust of the Saxon retreat had settled. Fresh brigades, held back for exactly this kind of emergency, wheeled left under Gustavus's direct command. Cavalry units peeled away from the right flank, where Pappenheim's shattered horsemen were no longer a threat, and thundered across the rear of the Swedish position. In the time it took the Imperial tercios to complete their slow, grinding turn toward the exposed flank, Gustavus had built a new line. From nothing, from chaos, from what should have been a death sentence. A new left flank stood where the Saxons had fled. Swedish brigades in their thin, flexible formations, cavalry ready to countercharge, artillery repositioning, those beautiful, lightweight guns that could actually move when you needed them to. The Imperial infantry completed their wheel. They advanced toward the Swedish position, expecting to find a broken, demoralized remnant. Easy prey. They found a wall of guns instead. The first Swedish volley tore into the tercio formations with devastating effect. These weren't frightened Saxons. These were Gustavus's own men, trained in his methods, armed with his weapons, fighting with a discipline that seemed almost supernatural. The Imperial advance stuttered. Stopped. For the first time that day, the veteran infantry found themselves facing something they didn't understand, an enemy that should have broken, and somehow hadn't. And Gustavus was just getting started. The afternoon sun hung lower now, casting long shadows across a field already carpeted with the dead. Smoke drifted in thick curtains, obscuring whole sections of the battle line, turning the world into a hellscape of noise and confusion and violence. But through that smoke, Gustavus Adolphus could see something that the Imperial commanders couldn't. He could see victory, not the desperate, clinging hope of a man trying to survive. Real victory, total victory, the kind that changes history. Because while Tilly's infantry had been busy chasing Saxons and repositioning for what they thought would be the killing blow, something had shifted. The momentum of battle, that invisible force that determines who lives and who dies, had changed hands. The Imperial Army was out of position. Their tercios had wheeled left to exploit the Saxon collapse. Their cavalry under Pappenheim was shattered, scattered, still trying to regroup from 7 failed charges. Their artillery sat in its original position, now pointing at empty space where the Saxons used to be. And Gustavus? Gustavus had a fresh battle line, intact reserves, mobile artillery that was already repositioning to exploit the chaos. He had something else, too, something that would prove decisive. He had speed. The tercio was many things, powerful, intimidating, nearly impossible to break from the front. But fast wasn't one of them. Those massive formations took forever to redeploy. Turning a tercio was like turning an ocean liner. By the time you completed the maneuver, the battle had moved on. Without you, Swedish brigades could redeploy in minutes. Their thinner formations meant faster movement. Their trained officers could execute complex maneuvers under fire. They could hit, pull back, wheel, and hit again while the Imperial infantry was still trying to figure out which direction to face. Gustavus gave the orders, and the Swedish army began to move. Not retreat, not defense, attack. The counterattack came from directions the Imperials weren't expecting. Swedish cavalry, the same horsemen who had been anchoring the right flank against Pappenheim's charges, swept around the battle's edge. They weren't caracoling. They weren't firing pistols from a distance. They were charging home, swords drawn, crashing into Imperial formations that were still trying to reorganize. Infantry brigades advanced in coordination, their musketeers delivering volley after devastating volley into the packed tercio formations. The Imperial soldiers were used to facing enemies who stood in dense blocks, easy targets for their pike pushes. They weren't used to this, these thin lines that could concentrate firepower at a single point, these formations that seemed to flow like water around their static positions. The fighting became general, chaotic, desperate. Across the entire field, Swedish units were pressing forward, finding gaps, exploiting weaknesses. The beautiful order of the morning had dissolved into a swirling nightmare of close combat and point-blank musketry. And then Gustavus played his masterstroke, the Imperial artillery, those massive guns that had been bombarding the Allied lines all morning. They sat in the center of the original Imperial position, now defended by only a skeleton crew. The gunners were still there, still firing, but the infantry that should have protected them had moved away, chasing the phantom of victory against the fleeing Saxons. Gustavus saw it. That battery of guns, practically undefended, the key to the entire Imperial position. He sent his men straight at it. The assault was brutal and brilliant. Swedish infantry and cavalry, working together in exactly the coordinated fashion Gustavus had drilled into them, smashed through the thin screen of defenders. Imperial gunners tried to fight back, tried to redirect their massive cannons, but those guns were built for bombardment, not close defense. Within minutes, it was over. The Swedish flag rose over the captured artillery. But Gustavus wasn't satisfied with just taking the guns. He turned them around. The Imperial Army had spent the morning being bombarded by Swedish artillery. Now their own guns, their own heavy cannons, loaded with their own ammunition, began firing into their own formations. Imagine being an Imperial infantryman in that moment. You've been fighting all day. Your cavalry has been broken. These strange Swedish formations won't stay still long enough to be destroyed. The Protestant left flank that was supposed to collapse has somehow rebuilt itself. And now your own artillery is murdering your own men. That's when armies break. Not from a single blow, but from the accumulation of impossibilities, from the growing, terrible realization that nothing is going the way it should, that the enemy you were supposed to crush is somehow crushing you instead. The Imperial center began to waver. Tilly saw it happening. The old general who had never lost a major battle, who had built his reputation on unshakable infantry and relentless aggression, watched his army start to come apart. He rode into the chaos personally, trying to rally his men, trying to restore some semblance of order. A Swedish musket ball found him. Then another. Tilly went down, badly wounded, dragged from the field by his aides. The Imperial Army had just lost its commander. But even without Tilly, the tercios might have held. These were veterans, after all. Men who had stood firm in a dozen battles. Men who knew that breaking meant death. Then, Gustavus hit them from the flank. Those lightweight Swedish brigades, those impossibly flexible formations, had been working around the edges of the Imperial position all afternoon. Now they struck home, not from the front, where the tercio was strongest, from the side, from the rear, from directions the formation was never designed to handle. A tercio facing forward was nearly unbreakable. A tercio being hit from 3 directions simultaneously was a death trap. The men on the edges couldn't tell where the next attack was coming from. The dense formation that had been their greatest strength became a killing ground, packed too tightly to maneuver, too deep to respond to threats from multiple angles. The first tercio broke, then another. Then the panic began to spread. There's a moment in every rout when the army stops being an army and becomes a mob, when discipline dissolves and every man thinks only of survival, when centuries of military tradition and training evaporate in the face of primal terror. For the Imperial Army at Breitenfeld, that moment came in the late afternoon of September 17th, 1631. Men who had never run from anything started running. Officers who had led from the front disappeared into the smoke. The legendary formations that had terrorized Protestant Germany for years dissolved into streams of fleeing individuals, and the Swedish cavalry went hunting. This is the part that history books sometimes gloss over. The pursuit. The hours after a battle when a beaten army becomes prey. When cavalry ride down exhausted infantry who have thrown away their weapons. When surrender isn't always accepted. When the killing continues until darkness finally forces it to stop. Gustavus's horsemen pursued the broken Imperial forces for miles, across fields and through forests, along roads choked with fleeing men. There was no mercy in it. Couldn't be. This was total war, and a beaten enemy who escaped today would return to fight tomorrow. The slaughter continued, until nightfall made further pursuit impossible. When it was finally over, when the guns fell silent and the screaming stopped, and the September darkness settled over Breitenfeld, the scale of what had happened began to become clear. The Imperial Army had ceased to exist, not defeated, not pushed back, destroyed. 13,600 men, killed or captured. Nearly half the army that had marched onto that field in the morning. The cream of the Catholic League's military power, the veterans who had won a decade of victories, lay dead in the fields outside Leipzig. All their artillery, captured. Every gun that had bombarded the Swedish lines now belonged to Gustavus, their battle standards, taken. The proud banners that had flown over a dozen triumphs now decorated the Swedish camp, their reputation shattered. The invincible Imperial Army had been proved very, very vincible indeed. And Tilly, the general who had never lost, he survived his wounds, but he would never fully recover. He would die the following year, a broken man commanding a broken army, his legend destroyed on that September afternoon, the morning after. Gustavus Adolphus walked the field at Breitenfeld as the sun rose on September 18th. Around him, the evidence of what had happened stretched to the horizon. Bodies, thousands of them, Imperial soldiers in their once proud uniforms, now twisted into the grotesque shapes of violent death. Horses lying where they had fallen, some still twitching. Abandoned weapons carpeting the ground so thickly that in places you couldn't see the grass beneath. The smell would have been overwhelming. Blood and gunpowder, and the first hints of decay. The sounds would have been worse, the moans of the wounded, the cries of dying men begging for water, for help, for a quick end to their suffering. This was victory. This was what it looked like up close. But Gustavus wasn't there to mourn. He was there to understand, to see with his own eyes what his theories had achieved, to confirm that the revolution he had been planning, training for, believing in, actually worked. And it had worked, beyond anything he could have imagined. Let's talk about what actually happened at Breitenfeld. Not the narrative, not the drama. The cold, hard military reality of why this battle mattered. The tercio was dead. Not literally, of course. Tercio formations would continue to be used for decades. But the myth of their invincibility, the belief that had dominated European military thinking for over a century, died on that field. Gustavus had proved that mass wasn't everything, that a smaller, faster, more flexible force could defeat a larger, heavier one, that the future of warfare belonged to speed and firepower, not depth and weight. This was a conceptual revolution. Imagine if someone today proved that aircraft carriers were obsolete. That's the scale of what Gustavus demonstrated. He didn't just win a battle. He showed that the fundamental assumptions underlying military strategy were wrong. His infantry tactics would be studied and copied across Europe. The Swedish brigade system, those thin, flexible formations with their devastating firepower, became the model for a new generation of armies. Within 2 decades, every major European power was reorganizing along Swedish lines. His cavalry doctrine spread even faster. The caracole died at Breitenfeld, killed just as thoroughly as those 13,000 Imperial soldiers. Cavalry commanders across the continent looked at what Gustavus's horsemen had achieved, holding against Pappenheim's charges, then sweeping around to deliver the killing blow, and understood that the future belonged to shock action, not pistol games, and his artillery, those lightweight, mobile guns that could reposition during a battle. They transformed how commanders thought about firepower. Artillery was no longer a static element, planted before battle and forgotten. It was a tool to be wielded, moved, concentrated at decisive points. The seeds of modern artillery doctrine were planted in the fields of Breitenfeld. But the immediate impact was even more dramatic. For the first time in 13 years, the Protestant cause had hope. You have to understand how desperate things had been before Breitenfeld. The 30 Years' War had been grinding on since 1618, and for the Protestant states of Germany, it had been one catastrophe after another. Armies destroyed, cities burned, whole regions depopulated. The Catholic League and the Holy Roman Emperor had seemed unstoppable, an inevitable tide that would eventually drown all resistance. Denmark had tried to intervene in 1625. The Danes had been crushed. Various Protestant German princes had raised armies. Those armies had been annihilated. By 1630, when Gustavus landed with his 13,000 Swedes, serious people were asking whether Protestantism in Germany could survive at all. The emperor was triumphant. The Catholic position seemed unassailable. Sweden's intervention looked like suicide, a small northern kingdom throwing itself against the mightiest military power in Europe. Breitenfeld changed everything. Suddenly, the emperor wasn't invincible. Suddenly, the Catholic League could be beaten. Suddenly, there was a champion, a proven, victorious champion, willing to fight for the Protestant cause. The political effects rippled outward like shock waves from an explosion. German Protestant states that had been cowering, trying to accommodate the emperor, suddenly found their courage. They flocked to Gustavus's banner, offering troops, money, supplies. The Swedish army that had numbered 23,000 at Breitenfeld would swell to over 100,000 in the coming months. France, Catholic France, sat up and took notice. Cardinal Richelieu, the master strategist guiding French policy, saw in Gustavus a weapon against Habsburg dominance. French gold began flowing to support Swedish operations. The war was transforming from a religious conflict into something larger, more complex, more devastating. The emperor scrambled to respond. New armies had to be raised, new commanders found, new strategies developed. Everything that had worked for 13 years suddenly didn't work anymore, and the imperial court descended into recrimination and panic. And Gustavus? Gustavus marched south. The road to central Germany lay open. The army that should have stopped him was scattered or dead. Tilly was wounded, his forces shattered, incapable of offering serious resistance. City after city fell to the Swedish advance. Territories that had been firmly under imperial control for years suddenly found themselves liberated by the Lion of the North. That nickname, the Lion of the North. Before Breitenfeld, it had been almost mocking. A provincial king with delusions of grandeur. After Breitenfeld, it was spoken with something between awe and terror. Gustavus had proved himself the greatest military mind of his age. His methods, his innovations, his sheer audacity, they had overturned a century of military convention in a single afternoon. Kings and generals across Europe studied reports of the battle, trying to understand how it had happened, how this Swedish upstart had achieved the impossible. The answer was both simple and profound. Gustavus hadn't just built a better army, he had built a different kind of army, one designed from the ground up around new principles: speed over mass, firepower over shock, flexibility over rigidity, combined arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery working together as a coordinated system, over the old approach of separate battles happening simultaneously on the same field. He had been thinking about this for years. Every campaign in Poland, every skirmish in the Baltic, had been a laboratory. He tested ideas, discarded what didn't work, refined what did. By the time he landed in Germany, his army was a perfected instrument, honed for exactly this kind of fight. And his men believed in him. That mattered too. They had trained under his system, they understood his methods. When Gustavus gave an order, they knew exactly what he wanted and exactly how to achieve it. That kind of institutional knowledge, that shared understanding between commander and commanded, was worth divisions of raw recruits. The Imperial Army had experienced soldiers. The Swedish army had experienced soldiers who fought as a unified system. The difference proved fatal. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because the story of Breitenfeld isn't just about what happened. It's about what it meant, what it showed about warfare, about leadership, about the gap between how things have always been done and how they could be done. Gustavus Adolphus walked onto that field with theories, ideas that contradicted everything the military establishment believed. He was told the tercio was invincible. He designed a formation to kill it. He was told cavalry couldn't stand against massed infantry. He trained horsemen who could. He was told artillery was a static weapon. He built guns that could dance. And when everything went wrong, when the Saxons broke, when half his army vanished, when any normal commander would have accepted defeat, he found a way to win anyway. That's the real miracle of Breitenfeld. Not just the victory, the manner of it, the refusal to accept that the situation was impossible, the calm, clear thinking in the middle of chaos, the ability to see opportunity where everyone else saw disaster. 13,600 Imperial casualties, all their artillery captured, their legendary army destroyed, their reputation shattered. And it was only the beginning. 1 year. That's all it took. 1 year from Gustavus Adolphus stepping onto German soil with 13,000 men to the complete destruction of the most feared army in Europe. 1 year from being laughed at by the great powers to being recognized as the most dangerous man on the continent. The Lion of the North had announced himself, and the old world of warfare would never recover. But here's the thing about revolutions. They demand a price. And Gustavus would pay his barely a year after Breitenfeld, at another field, in another battle, where his luck and his life would finally run out. Lutzen. November 1632, another clash with Imperial forces, another Swedish victory, but this time Gustavus led a cavalry charge personally into the fog and smoke. This time the king got separated from his men. This time Imperial soldiers found him alone, wounded, vulnerable. They shot him in the head. The Lion of the North died in the mud, aged 37, at the height of his powers, with his revolution incomplete. He would never see how thoroughly his ideas would transform European warfare. Never know that generals would be studying Breitenfeld for centuries. Never understand that he had changed. Everything. There's something almost unbearably tragic about it. This man who had proved the impossible possible, who had taken a frozen northern kingdom and turned it into a military superpower, who had looked at how war had always been fought and said, "No, there's a better way." Dead in a cavalry skirmish, one of the greatest military minds in history, killed in exactly the kind of close-quarters chaos he had always courted. But death couldn't undo what he had built. Sweden remained a great power for decades after Gustavus fell. His generals, men he had trained, who understood his methods, continued the war. The Swedish army he had created continued to win battles using the tactics he had developed. The 30 Years' War ground on until 1648, and when it finally ended, the map of Europe had been redrawn. The Holy Roman Empire was broken, shattered into hundreds of effectively independent states. The emperor's dream of a unified Catholic Germany died in the same fields where Gustavus had killed the tercio. The Peace of Westphalia that ended the war established principles, sovereignty, religious tolerance, the balance of power, that would shape European politics for centuries. None of it would have happened without Breitenfeld. That single afternoon, that one battle where everything came together, where years of preparation met a moment of supreme crisis and produced something miraculous. Think about the decisions that made it possible. The decision to land in Germany at all when everyone said it was suicide. The decision to train his army in methods that contradicted established doctrine. The decision to trust those thin formations, those charging cavalry, those mobile guns against veterans who had never lost. And the decision, the supernatural, impossible decision, to keep fighting when the Saxons broke, to rebuild a flank from nothing, to turn defeat into victory through sheer force of will. Any other commander would have retreated, would have saved what he could, and lived to fight another day. The textbooks would have said it was the right choice. The professionals would have nodded approvingly, and the Protestant cause in Germany would have died, slowly strangled by an enemy that had proved once again that it couldn't be beaten. Gustavus refused the textbook answer. He refused to accept that the battle was lost. He looked at a situation that was impossible and found a way through it anyway. That's what makes Breitenfeld more than just a battle. It's a lesson, a proof of concept, a demonstration that the conventional wisdom isn't always wise, that the way things have always been done isn't always the way they have to be done. The Imperial Army came to that field with a century of success behind them. They had the veterans, they had the reputation, they had every reason to believe that this battle would end like all the others. They were wrong. They were wrong because one man had spent years asking uncomfortable questions. What if our formations are too deep? What if our cavalry tactics are obsolete? What if our artillery could do more? What if everything we think we know about warfare is holding us back? Gustavus asked those questions. Then he tested the answers. Then he bet his kingdom, his army, and his life on being right. At Breitenfeld, he collected on that bet. 13,000 men, that's what he brought to Germany. A force so small that the emperor barely bothered to acknowledge it. A gamble so audacious that serious observers thought he had lost his mind. 13,000 men, and a theory about how war should be fought. The theory won. When the smoke cleared on September 17, 1631, the old world of warfare lay dying in the fields outside Leipzig. The tertio was broken. The caracole was dead. The static artillery battery was obsolete. Everything that military professionals had believed for generations was proved wrong in a single afternoon. And standing in the wreckage, surveying what he had achieved, was a 37-year-old king who had just changed history. He didn't know he only had 14 months to live. Didn't know that Lutzen was waiting for him. Didn't know that he would never see old age, never see his daughter grow up, never see the final victory in the war he had transformed. All he knew in that moment was that he had been right. The experts had laughed at him. The great powers had dismissed him. The conventional wisdom had said he would fail. He had proved them all wrong. That's the story of Breitenfeld. Not just a battle, a revolution, a moment when one man's vision collided with reality, and reality blinked first. The Lion of the North came to Germany with 13,000 men and changed the world. And on a September afternoon outside Leipzig, he proved that the impossible is just another word for what hasn't been done yet.